In the small Texas town of Somerville, where church was the heartbeat of the community, a scandal of biblical proportions unraveled. A preacher's forbidden affair with a lonely wife spiraled into jealousy, betrayal, and murder, shaking the town to its core. This is the story of love gone wrong, a life lost, and justice served in a tale that left Somerville forever changed. In the 2012, Somerville was a quaint Texas town, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. Life revolved around Sunday church services, potluck dinners, and porch-side conversations. At the center of it all was Pastor Daniel Cross, a man who carried the weight of his congregation on his shoulders. His sermons brought people to tears, and his presence brought them comfort. But behind the pulpit, Daniel was a man drowning in his own loneliness. Daniel's marriage to Eleanor Cross was far from perfect. Eleanor came from a wealthy, influential family in Somerville. Her father owned half the town's businesses, and her mother was the social queen of every church luncheon. Eleanor took after them, focusing more on status than substance. She loved throwing lavish events and ensuring the Cross name stayed on everyone's lips. But when it came to Daniel, her love was transactional. Behind the polished smile and expensive pearls, Eleanor was cold and distant. For years, Daniel tried to bridge the emotional gap in their marriage, but Eleanor wasn't interested. She had what she wanted: a picture-perfect image of a preacher's wife. As long as Daniel played his role, she was satisfied. But inside, Daniel was crumbling. He longed for companionship, someone to see him as more than just Pastor Cross. Then came Cassandra Walker, a woman battling her own demons. Cassie had married Tom Walker, a stoic and emotionally detached man, out of necessity rather than love. Tom was a mechanic who spent more time at his garage than at home. Their marriage was like an empty house, functional but void of warmth. Cassie, only 34, felt as if her life had passed her by. She had no children, no spark, and no purpose. At a church fundraiser in late March 2012, Cassie caught Daniel's eye. She wore a simple but flattering dress, her laughter carrying across the room as she spoke to the other women. But beneath her charm was a deep sadness, something Daniel recognized because he felt it too. That evening, Cassie approached Daniel with a plate of homemade cornbread and a smile that lingered a second too long. Their conversation began innocently about the church's new roof fund, but soon drifted into more personal territory. Cassie confided that she often felt out of place in Somerville, like she didn't belong. Daniel listened, his eyes softening. He felt seen, something Eleanor hadn't given him in years. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent. It started with shared smiles during the Bible study on Wednesday evenings. Cassie began staying behind after church events, finding reasons to help Daniel clean up or organize hymnals. Each encounter felt charged, a tension building between them. By the mid-May 2012, their stolen glances turned into something more. They arranged to meet privately, first at Cassie's home, when Tom was working late, then at a secluded motel on the outskirts of town. These moments were intoxicating for both of them. Cassie found in Daniel the emotional connection she had craved for years. Daniel, in turn, felt alive for the first time in what seemed like forever. Their affair quickly became an all-consuming passion. Cassie became reckless, leaving traces of her perfume on Daniel's shirt and lipstick smudges on his collar. Daniel tried to maintain control, praying for strength every night, but his resolve faltered whenever he saw Cassie. By September 2012, Cassie started feeling unwell. Frequent nausea, fatigue, and a sense of heaviness she couldn't ignore. A visit to the local clinic confirmed what she already suspected. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a mix of fear and excitement. She told Daniel during one of their secret meetings at the motel. His reaction was immediate. Panic washed over his face. For Cassie, the pregnancy was a beacon of hope, a chance to start a new life away from the suffocating constraints of Somerville. She envisioned running away with Daniel, raising their child together, far from the prying eyes of the town. But for Daniel, it was a crisis. He was already racked with guilt over the affair, and the thought of a child threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. He couldn't bring himself to leave his congregation, and he certainly couldn't face Eleanor. Cassie tried to convince him. She spoke of the life they could build together, free from judgment and pretense. Daniel listened, but hesitated. He told her he needed time to think, though in truth, he was paralyzed by fear. Unbeknownst to both of them, Eleanor had been growing suspicious. She noticed Daniel's late nights and the way he seemed distracted during their conversations. Eleanor was not a woman to be crossed. Her marriage to Daniel was a cornerstone of her image, and she couldn't afford a scandal. Eleanor began watching Daniel more closely. In early October 2012, she followed him one evening after Bible study, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. What she saw confirmed her worst fears: Daniel entering the motel where Cassie was waiting. Her discovery left her seething. To Eleanor, this wasn't just infidelity. It was a threat to her entire identity. If the affair became public, her name would be dragged through the mud, and her family's reputation would be destroyed. For weeks, she stewed in silence, plotting her next move. Then, one afternoon, while organizing donations at the church, Eleanor overheard Cassie talking to a friend about her pregnancy. Though Cassie didn't name the father, Eleanor knew. The revelation was the breaking point. Cassie wasn't just having an affair with her husband. She was carrying his child. Eleanor's fury transformed into cold calculation. She wasn't just going to confront Cassie. She was going to ensure that this woman and her unborn child could never threaten her life again. It was a cold and stormy night in mid-October 2012, when Eleanor Cross decided to take matters into her own hands. Rain lashed against the windows of her stately home as she sat in her living room, staring at the flickering flames of the fireplace. The storm mirrored her internal chaos, a swirl of rage and despair that had grown unbearable since discovering her husband's betrayal. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind: the affair, the pregnancy, and the audacity of Cassandra Walker to endanger everything Eleanor had built. For Eleanor, the thought of losing control over her carefully curated life was unbearable. The scandal would ruin her reputation, her standing in the community, and the Cross family name. It wasn't just about jealousy. It was about survival. Her marriage to Pastor Daniel had been her armor, her way of maintaining relevance and power, in a town where image was everything. Now Cassie threatened to tear it all apart. Eleanor spent days planning her next move. She knew confronting Daniel wouldn't solve anything. He was weak, too easily swayed by his emotions. Cassie, however, was a different story. To Eleanor, Cassie represented everything that was wrong with the world: reckless, selfish, and destructive. The fact that she carried Daniel's child was the ultimate insult, a reminder that Cassie had succeeded where Eleanor had failed. On the evening of October 17th, 2012, Eleanor reached out to Cassie under the guise of a private conversation. She framed it as an attempt to make peace, appealing to Cassie's vulnerability. Cassie, perhaps naively, agreed. Eleanor chose the meeting spot carefully, an old barn on the outskirts of Somerville, where she knew they wouldn't be disturbed. As the rain poured down, Eleanor arrived at the barn carrying an umbrella and a heavy candlestick hidden in her bag. She waited for Cassie to arrive, her thoughts racing. When she saw the younger woman step out of her car, drenched but determined, Eleanor felt a surge of hatred she could barely contain. Inside the barn, the confrontation began. Eleanor wasted no time accusing Cassie of destroying her marriage and ruining her life. Cassie didn't back down. She admitted to the affair, even revealing the pregnancy, hoping to force Eleanor to face the truth. But instead of diffusing the situation, the confession acted as a trigger. Eleanor snapped. Her vision blurred with anger as the two women argued. Cassie, still believing there was some humanity in Eleanor, tried to reason with her, but Eleanor wasn't listening. She saw only a threat that needed to be eliminated. The argument escalated into a physical struggle, with Cassie trying to defend herself against Eleanor's growing rage. Eleanor pulled the candlestick from her bag. In the heat of the moment, she swung it with all her strength, striking Cassie on the side of her head. The force of the blow sent Cassie crashing to the ground, blood pooling beneath her. Eleanor froze for a moment, staring at what she had done. Then, in a panic, she dropped the candlestick and fled the barn, leaving Cassie's lifeless body behind. The following morning, October 18th, 2012, the rain had stopped, but the town of Somerville was cloaked in an eerie calm. A local farmer, Henry Mathis, was out checking on his livestock near the abandoned barn when he noticed something unusual. The barn door was slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. Curious, Henry stepped inside and immediately recoiled at the sight before him. Cassie's body lay on the cold, damp floor, her face pale and her eyes lifeless. Blood had dried in a dark pool around her head, and the candlestick rested nearby, still stained with her blood. The scene was horrific, a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of the barn. Henry, shaken to his core, ran back to his truck and called the police. By 9 a.m., the barn was swarming with investigators. Detective Lauren Martinez, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, arrived at the scene. She surveyed the area with a practiced eye, noting the brutality of the attack. The blow to Cassie's head was precise, but vicious, and the lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been caught off guard. The investigators worked methodically, collecting evidence and documenting every detail. They bagged the candlestick, noting the fingerprints on its surface, and photographed the blood patterns around Cassie's body. Detective Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random act of violence. The personal nature of the attack suggested a deeper motive, one rooted in anger and betrayal. By October 20th, 2012, the police had begun questioning those closest to Cassie. Her husband, Tom Walker, was the first person they brought in. Tom's reaction to his wife's death was puzzling. He seemed detached, almost indifferent, as if he had already mourned the loss of their relationship long ago. He admitted that their marriage had been strained for years, and that he was aware of Cassie's infidelity, but claimed he didn't care enough to act on it. Detective Martinez found his demeanor unsettling, but ultimately believed his lack of emotion stemmed from resignation rather than guilt. With little evidence tying him to the crime, the investigators began exploring other angles. On October 24th, 2012, a breakthrough came when a search of Cassie's belongings revealed a hidden stash of love letters exchanged between her and Pastor Daniel. The letters were explicit, detailing their affair and Cassie's hopes for a future together. Detective Martinez immediately brought Daniel in for questioning. Racked with guilt, Daniel confessed to the affair, but vehemently denied any involvement in Cassie's death. He described his struggles with his faith, his crumbling marriage, and his guilt over betraying his congregation. The revelation sent shockwaves through Somerville. The town's beloved pastor was now at the center of a scandal that threatened to tear the community apart. As the investigation progressed, Detective Martinez began to focus on Eleanor. Witnesses had reported her increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to Cassie's death. Eleanor's public persona remained composed, but those close to her noticed cracks in her facade. The turning point came when a search warrant was executed at the Cross Estate on November 1st, 2012. Among Eleanor's belongings, investigators found a blood-stained scarf tucked away in the back of her closet. The scarf's fibers matched those found at the crime scene, and forensic testing confirmed it was stained with Cassie's blood. The evidence was damning. Combined with Eleanor's motive and erratic behavior, it painted a clear picture of her involvement in the murder. On the morning of November 15th, 2012, police arrived at the Cross residence to arrest Eleanor. She was hosting a brunch for the church's women's group, a final attempt to maintain her perfect image. As officers led her away in handcuffs, the room fell silent. The women, who had once admired Eleanor's poise and elegance, now stared at her in disbelief. Eleanor maintained her composure, though her eyes betrayed the panic she felt. The community of Somerville was stunned. Their perfect preacher's wife was now the prime suspect in a murder case, and the life they thought they knew was crumbling before their eyes. The arrest marked the beginning of a long journey toward justice for Cassie, leaving Somerville to grapple with the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. The trial of Eleanor Cross began in March 2013 at the county courthouse in Somerville, a town that had never seen a scandal of this magnitude. Word of the case had spread far beyond the town's borders, drawing reporters, curious onlookers, and even legal enthusiasts from neighboring counties. The courtroom was packed every day, with rows filled by community members, many of whom had once admired Eleanor. The air was thick with tension and morbid curiosity. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lisa Thompson, set the tone from the start. Thompson was a skilled and relentless attorney who understood the importance of the case. She painted Eleanor as a cold, calculating woman who was willing to commit murder to protect her reputation. Using the evidence gathered from the Cross home, the blood-stained scarf, witness testimonies, and Eleanor's erratic behavior, Thompson wove a narrative of control, jealousy, and premeditation. She reminded the jury that Eleanor had not acted out of passion, but out of a desire to eliminate a threat to her carefully constructed life. The defense, led by Charles Grant, a well-known and experienced lawyer, had a difficult case to argue. Grant chose to frame Eleanor's actions as a momentary lapse in judgment, spurred by her husband's betrayal and the humiliation of Cassie's pregnancy. He argued that Eleanor's reaction was one of rage, not premeditation, and urged the jury to consider the emotional toll she had endured in the months leading up to the murder. As the trial unfolded, the emotional toll on everyone involved became clear. Pastor Daniel Cross, once the town's moral compass, became the trial's most compelling witness. His testimony was a study in guilt and vulnerability. He admitted to his affair with Cassie, describing how their relationship had grown from shared loneliness into something he deeply regretted. Daniel's words about Eleanor revealed a woman obsessed with appearances, someone who cared more about maintaining her public image than nurturing their marriage. He spoke of her coldness and how it had pushed him into a place of despair. Yet, even as he shared these painful truths, Daniel expressed sorrow for how his choices had contributed to the tragedy. His voice trembled as he described how the weight of his guilt had driven him to resign from the church. The courtroom was silent during Daniel's testimony, the only sounds coming from Eleanor's sharp breaths. She sat at the defense table, her face stoic, but her eyes betraying flashes of emotion. Anger, perhaps, or shame. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, refusing to show remorse for what had happened. To some, her cold demeanor reinforced the prosecution's argument that she was capable of murder. Other witnesses, including neighbors and members of the church, testified to Eleanor's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. They described her as increasingly erratic, a stark contrast to the polished and composed woman they thought they knew. Some recalled overhearing her complain about Cassie, her words laced with disdain and fury. One of the most striking moments of the trial came when the prosecution displayed photographs from the crime scene. The gruesome images of Cassie's lifeless body and the blood-stained candlestick were a stark reminder of the violence that had occurred. Many in the courtroom turned away, unable to look, but Eleanor stared straight ahead, unflinching. The trial lasted for nearly 3 weeks, with every detail dissected and debated. By the time the jury began deliberations on the March 18, 2013, the community of Somerville was deeply divided. Some believed Eleanor was a victim of her circumstances, while others saw her as a ruthless woman who would stop at nothing to protect her social standing. On March 20, 2013, the jury returned their verdict. After 2 days of deliberation, they found Eleanor Cross guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Cassie's few remaining family members wept quietly in the back row. Pastor Daniel lowered his head, a mixture of relief and sorrow etched on his face. Eleanor remained expressionless, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the town of Somerville, the trial's conclusion marked the end of a long and painful chapter. But the repercussions of Eleanor's actions, and those of everyone involved, would ripple through the community for years to come. The fallout from the trial was immediate and far-reaching. Pastor Daniel Cross, unable to reconcile his faith with his sins, resigned from his position at the church. On April 5th, 2013, he delivered his final sermon to a somber congregation. Many in the church were torn between their anger at his betrayal and their sympathy for his obvious remorse. Afterward, Daniel packed his belongings and left Somerville, retreating to a small town where he could try to rebuild his life in anonymity. Tom Walker, Cassie's estranged husband, quietly sold their home and moved away from Somerville in May 2013. He didn't attend the trial or make any public statements about Cassie's death, leaving many to wonder how deeply he had truly cared for her. Some whispered that he was relieved to be free from the marriage, while others saw his departure as a sign of grief too heavy to bear. For Emily Cross, Eleanor, and Daniel's teenage daughter, the events were devastating. At just 14 years old, Emily was forced to grapple with the reality of her mother's crime and her father's affair. In June 2013, she moved in with extended family in Dallas, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. Emily's departure was the final blow to the Cross family, a once respected household now fractured beyond repair. Somerville, a town once defined by its close-knit community and southern charm, became a place haunted by scandal and loss. The church struggled to regain its footing, attendance dwindling as members grappled with the betrayal of their trusted pastor. The story of Eleanor's trial and Daniel's affair became a cautionary tale, whispered about in homes and diners for years to come. The town had learned a painful lesson. Even in places where appearances are carefully maintained, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. And when that darkness is unleashed, the consequences can be devastating. What drives a person to kill for the sake of reputation? How did love and faith turn into betrayal and tragedy? This tale of Somerville reminds us that behind closed doors, even the most righteous can succumb to the darkest sins. This case is a very sad one that reminds us of the dangers friends and family can bring to us. Make sure to check out our other cases, like the case where a housewife's secret affair with cousin's teenage son ends bad. Make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss out on our daily updates.